It was an eerily quiet night in Ravensburg, the kind that made seasoned officers uneasy. The streets lay deserted, bathed under the faint amber glow of scattered streetlights. Officer Daniel Hayes adjusted his rearview mirror and cast a glance at his longtime partner, Shadow. The Belgian Malinois K-9 sat alert as ever, his deep brown eyes scanning every movement beyond the windshield. Daniel had patrolled these streets for years, but something about tonight's stillness felt off. The radio crackled with occasional updates, but no major incidents had been reported. Shadow, usually calm, suddenly stiffened. His ears perked, and within seconds he erupted into a sharp bark, his gaze locked onto a dark-colored SUV parked just ahead. Daniel's pulse quickened. Shadow's instincts were rarely wrong. Shifting the patrol car into park, he grabbed his flashlight and stepped out, Shadow trotting closely at his side, growling softly. As they neared the vehicle, the outline of a figure in the driver's seat became visible. In the back, partially obscured by a thin blanket, lay something small and still, a baby. The sight sent a jolt of unease through Daniel. The infant's face was pale, its tiny chest rising and falling unevenly. Shadow barked again, louder this time, his posture rigid with urgency. Daniel tapped the window with his flashlight. The man inside flinched slightly before rolling it down. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the night's chill. His eyes darted between Daniel and Shadow, his fingers twitching against the steering wheel. "Evening, sir," Daniel said evenly. "Mind telling me what you're doing parked here this late?" The man hesitated, voice unsteady. Just resting. My kid's asleep in the back." Daniel angled his flashlight toward the rear seat, illuminating the child's face. The unnatural stillness sent a fresh wave of alarm through him. Shadow let out a deep, insistent growl, his gaze never leaving the infant. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification." The man hesitated before handing over his license. Daniel barely glanced at it. His instincts were already screaming that something was wrong. Every answer the man gave was evasive, details not quite aligning. His fingers gripped the door handle tightly. Then, without warning, he bolted. "Shadow, go!" The Belgian Malinois lunged forward like a streak of lightning, muscles rippling as he gave chase. Daniel sprinted right behind, heart pounding, flashlight cutting through the darkness. The suspect zigzagged through parked cars, but Shadow was faster. With practiced precision, he leaped and latched onto the man's arm, bringing him crashing to the pavement. By the time Daniel caught up, the suspect had stopped struggling, face twisted in resignation. "Who is that child?" Daniel demanded. After a long pause, the man swallowed hard. "I took him." His voice was barely a whisper. "I took the baby." A chill ran down Daniel's spine. Shadow stood guard by the SUV, his gaze fixed protectively on the child. Without wasting a second, Daniel radioed for backup and an ambulance. The baby didn't look well, and Shadow knew it. The flashing lights of the ambulance painted streaks across the quiet street as paramedics rushed forward. "He's in rough shape," one of them muttered, checking the infant's vitals. "Severe dehydration. We need to move fast." Daniel glanced at Shadow, whose tail flicked slightly, eyes filled with something deeper than instinct, concern. "Let him ride with the baby," Daniel said quietly. The paramedics exchanged glances but nodded. Moments later, Shadow hopped into the ambulance, settling near the stretcher where the baby lay wrapped in blankets. His body remained tense, eyes never leaving the child. Daniel followed behind in his patrol car, lights flashing. Despite all his years on the force, he couldn't shake the image of Shadow's unwavering focus on that fragile life. This wasn't just another case. For Shadow, it was personal. The hospital was a blur of motion and urgency. Nurses and doctors worked swiftly, attaching IVs, checking vitals. Shadow remained stationed near the entrance of the trauma room, unmoving yet tense, as if the baby's survival rested on his watch. His ears twitched at every sound, his eyes darting from nurse to doctor, searching their faces for answers. One of the nurses paused beside Daniel. "Is he always like this?" she asked softly. Daniel shook his head. "Never seen him like this before." He exhaled. "It's like he knows." Hours crawled by. Shadow never moved from his spot, pacing occasionally, letting out soft whimpers. Daniel crouched beside him, placing a reassuring hand on his back. "Hang in there, buddy. He's fighting. So are they." Time stretched endlessly. Then, finally, the trauma room door swung open. A nurse stepped out, pulling down her mask. "The baby's stable," she said gently. "He's weak, but improving." Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Shadow, as if understanding every word, wagged his tail lightly. He took a cautious step toward the door, eyes bright with relief. Within an hour, the baby's parents arrived. A young couple, their eyes red from days of crying, rushed through the corridors. Shadow, sensing the shift in energy, stood up, tail wagging slowly. Daniel led them toward the pediatric unit. The mother clutched her hands to her chest, barely able to speak. The father, voice thick with emotion, whispered, "Thank you." Shadow walked beside them, steady and protective. He didn't know their names. He didn't need to. He just understood. As they stepped into the softly lit hospital room, the baby stirred, a faint murmur escaping his lips. Relief flooded the parents' faces. Shadow sat at the foot of the hospital bed, watching, waiting. Only when the mother reached down, cradling her child close, did he finally relax. For Shadow, it had never been about duty. It was something deeper. A quiet, instinctive care for the most vulnerable. And tonight, he had fulfilled his purpose in the only way he knew how. By protecting a life that couldn't protect itself.